Hello everyone! In this new series of tutorials that I'll be making, I'd like to explain how to play one of my most favorite games of all time, Dwarf Fortress. Dwarf Fortress is an incredibly intricate world simulator, and can be daunting for anyone unfamiliar with the game to pick up and play. With this tutorial, you'll be able to run a fully functional dwarf fort, no matter the situation you embark into. Quick note, this guide will focus exclusively on dwarf mode. I probably won't cover adventurer mode at all. Before we get started, I'd like to note that I'm playing on the latest Dwarf Fortress version, which is 43.05. I'm also using one of the different starter packs available online. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. And this pack includes several utilities that makes playing Dwarf Fortress far more enjoyable, including Dwarf Therapist, as well as a variety of different tile sets that actually give the game some graphics. Otherwise, I always feel like the game just becomes this mess of symbols that you have to decode before you understand what's actually going on. When you want to start playing Dwarf Fortress, the first thing you have to do is generate a world. This completely randomly generates an entire planet for you to play on, complete with its own unique history, different wildlife and climates, cultures, gods, and of course, giant monsters. So we start this by pressing Create World. Now you can just skip past this message, and then it will bring up the variety of options that you'll have for generating a new world. Each of these options allows you to customize your world in different ways. And it's important to understand what each of these does to create a world that suits your particular playstyle or your particular desires for the world you want to start your fort in. World size is pretty self-explanatory. It basically means how large the world is that you're going to generate. In this specific instance, I'd say bigger is better because larger worlds have more different civilizations in it, more different creatures, more mega beasts. You have more places to start your fort on. So generally, making a medium or large world is recommended. It's important to note, however, that if you're running on an older computer that might not have a lot of power, then you might not want to generate a medium or a large world, because the larger the world is, the more time it will take for your world to be created, and also the more events will take place in your world while you're playing, which means that the game can slow down if your world is very large and your computer can't handle it. So in my particular case, let's just put this on large, because I love large worlds. The second option is history. Now history is a little hard to predict exactly what it'll do to your game. If you put your history at very short, what basically happens is that your world gets created by whatever forces exist, and you start playing pretty much at that moment. So a lot of the civilizations have only just begun building and reproducing. Mega beasts still wander the world everywhere and occasionally eat up a town or whatever. And for instance, vampires and other cursed sentient beings may be very rare because the world is very young, which means that a lot of the events that cause gods to curse people will not have happened yet. Similarly, if you put history on long or very long, you might end up in situations where you start a world that has no mega beasts in it anymore because all of the mega beasts were wiped out by civilizations. Similarly, civilizations might be wiped out completely because they waged war with the wrong people and were invaded and destroyed. This might also mean that it's possible for the dwarven civilization, so the one that you want to start out with, might be wiped out by some foreign force. This doesn't happen usually unless you set your history to long or very long, but it's important to note that this can happen. There are other factors in play here, of course, but the different amounts of history you put in your world can have very widespread effects on how you will experience the game. To name just some small examples, if you have a world that has a very short history, you're going to run into a lot more mega beasts. If you have a world that has a very long history, you're going to run into a lot more vampires. In my personal recommendation for this option is to set it to short or medium, and not to deviate from those two options unless you have something specific in mind for your new game. So I'm just going to set it to short, so that at least you'll have some history. The civilizations in the world will have just over a century to spread, but you'll still have a world full of mega beasts and full of other fantastical creatures. The number of civilizations means how many races there are if you're on a relatively small world. And on larger worlds, it means how many individual cultures there are within those different races. For instance, a world might have the elven race, but might also have like 6 or more different cultures within the elven race, which will all be representing different towns and villages belonging to the elves. Now, in-game, you're not going to see a lot of advantage from having a lot of different civilizations in the world. Because if you have elven neighbors, for instance, there's not going to be any differentiation between which specific elven culture you are engaging in trade with or diplomacy with. And if, say, you happen to anger the civilization that you are closest to, then that means you're going to go at war with the entire elven race, not just that one civilization. So generally you want to just put this on medium, possibly on low. Though medium is my personal recommendation in this case. It'll give you a variety of different cultures across the world without going overboard. It's important to note that if you set this to high or very high, that can cause some weird things to happen. In particularly, that might cause a lot of kobolds, elves, and humans to spawn on your map. As opposed to dwarves or goblins, who will definitely be in the minority. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be harder for those specific civilizations to survive in a world like that. Since if the humans are the overwhelming majority of the world's civilizations and they go at war with the goblins are going to get wiped out in short order. Which of course will make your game a fair bit more boring, since there's not going to be enough goblins in the world to threaten your fort. So my personal recommendation, like I always said, is to just leave this at medium. Medium is the option I recommend for this specific stat. Now the number of sites indicates how many separate towns and cities and whatever can exist on your world. There's a hard cap to this, and once that cap is reached, no civilization will be able to start new forts or new hideaways or new towns. So having a lot of different sites in the world means that civilization can very rapidly expand and becomes quite powerful in both the short and the long run, since there will be villages and towns everywhere. On the other hand, having a very low number of sites can cause civilizations to struggle to survive, because let's say there's only room for like 25 sites in your world and there's 20 different civilizations. That means that most civilizations in your world will not have more than 1 or at most 2 different cities. This means that there may be only 1 mega beast attack away from getting completely wiped out. So it's important to make sure to balance your number of sites with your number of civilizations. If you don't have enough sites in your world, then civilizations are going to struggle. And if you have too many sites in your world, civilizations will quickly outgrow the threats that your world has to offer them. Now the number of beasts option doesn't actually influence how many animals there are in your world. Rather, the number of beasts in your world gives you an indication of how many mega beasts and other large monsters there are in your world. Now, it's important to note that there's a hard cap on the number of mega beasts, semi-mega beasts, and titans there is in the world, and you can manipulate this hard cap with this specific option. Now, my personal favorite level for this option is to put it on very high, because mega beasts are, for the most part, just a threat to your fort, but under very rare circumstances, you may be able to capture a mega beast that's very valuable, that you can use for yourself. For instance, rocks and hydras can be caught and trained for your civilization. If you want to maximize your chances for something like that happening, you want to set this option as high as possible. This has one small side effect in the world at large, and that's that civilizations will struggle a bit more than they normally would, because having more mega beasts in the world means that civilizations get attacked more frequently by mega beasts. In general, you won't notice too much if you have a very high number of beasts. when you're playing in Fortress mode, because the only thing this will really do for your fort is to ensure you will get a Mega Beast attack when your fort's wealth gets high enough. And it will ensure that you will constantly see Mega Beast attacks even as your fort grows relatively old. In some cases, if you set this statistic too low, you may end up running out of Mega Beasts in your world that can attack your fort. This isn't a disaster, but it makes the game a little more boring, because dealing with Mega Beasts is one of the fun aspects of the game. Now obviously, if you don't want that additional challenge of having to deal with Mega Beasts, you can always set this to a lower statistic, like very low or medium. It's not that big of a deal, but my personal recommendation is to set it to very high. That makes for the best experience in my opinion. Savagery is an indication of how likely the world is to generate biomes, which are environments basically, or embark sites if you prefer, that are savage. Now that may sound a little odd. What it basically means is that savage biomes are places where nature has gone wild and has caused animals to grow to enormous proportion. I should say even animals and plants, because savage biomes are also the source of high wood, which is the heaviest type of wood in the game. And it's also a tree type that grows larger than any other tree type in the game, which makes it an excellent source of wood. Setting your map to very high savagery, which is my personal favorite level for this option, makes the game a little harder. It kind of depends on a lot of different factors, because there is a chance, for instance, that if you start off in a savage biome, that you will end up having your dwarves spawn right next to a bunch of giant wild animals that are very dangerous, with some very nasty results. They might get like torn apart instantly. That doesn't necessarily always happen. In fact, I dare say that's quite rare to happen, even if you start on savage biomes. But the savage biomes have all sorts of threats that you have to be wary of. There's the threat of giant alligators dragging your fisher dwarves to their death. There's the threat of giant eagles coming down from the mountains and tearing apart your dwarves while they're walking around on the surface. There's the threat of giant apes. I don't remember the exact kind of apes, but giant apes coming out of the forest and stealing your supplies with their greedy little mitts. And of course there's that one very famous example that I'll never forget, of one fort that I started in a savage biome that had a giant tick spawn just outside of my fort, and that giant tick ended up using its proboscis, so that blood-sucking mouthpiece that it has, to basically pierce the skulls of several of the dwarves I sent to kill it, and it's basically sucked out their brains. And that tick ended up becoming one of the legendary creatures of my world. Which is kind of sad if you think about it, because giant ticks only grow like 1 year old. Anyway, if you don't want to have to deal with the potential of savage biomes, you can always set this to very low. You won't really miss out on a lot if you do, but savage biomes are very, very interesting to start off in, because giant animals, despite the risk that they pose, are potentially incredibly profitable to your fort. For instance, their meat is a lot more valuable than the meat of regular animals, which means that your dwarves are a lot easier to keep happy if you feed them the meat of giant animals. Similarly, giant animal bones are also worth a lot more to traders, which means you can use those to create crafts, which you can then trade with the caravan every year to get more goods. So it's kind of a personal preference whether you want to start off in savage biomes or not. Doing so will make the game a little harder for you, but as I already explained, it can be very worthwhile doing so. If you don't want to deal with savage biomes, just set this to a lower level. It doesn't really matter, because even if you raise the savagery of your world to very high, there will always be non-savage biomes on your world. There will just be less of them. So don't worry too much about that. However, the last option in this list is very important, and that's mineral occurrence. Mineral occurrence basically is an indication of how many ores have spawned around the world. So ores are what your dwarves will mine out of the ground and then melt down into metals. Having this set to very rare or rare is incredibly dangerous, because that means that you may not be able to find a good embark site that has any weapon grade metals, or might only have one type of weapon grade metal. So generally you want to keep your mineral occurrence at frequent. You might also be able to set it to everywhere, but I generally do not recommend doing so. Mostly because in an earlier version there was a bug involved with setting it to everywhere. So just keep it to frequent, and that should provide you with enough minerals to get through your entire fort's lifespan. Once we have set all the different options to our personal preferences, remember, it's your game, just set these to whatever you think you prefer. Then just press the Y key to generate your world. Now the game will be generating your entire world completely randomly. It's always really interesting to watch this. But this can take a while depending on your settings. For instance, having a lot of sites and having a lot of history and having a very large world can make this process take quite a while. So generally you can just let the game run and create this new world for you, and then in the meantime just do something else, and we'll be right back once the world is done generating. And we're back. Now, as we can see, the world has been fully formed with deserts, forests, mountains, oceans, potentially even some polar caps if we're lucky. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, there's a lot to see on this page, but none of it is really that important if you're just starting out. A lot of it isn't really important if you're an advanced player, so at this point just press enter to accept this world. Now it'll start saving this world. This again can take a while depending on the size of your world. For the most part, just let it run for a while. Eventually it'll kick you back to the main menu. Don't be alarmed, that's normal. And then you can press the start playing button. At that point you're gonna start embarking your dwarves, but we'll get to that in the next video. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode.